On a quiet day in May, Mobius Digital released their first foray into video games proper out into the public. Since then, it has captivated millions of players across all platforms and has skyrocketed to the top of many people's favorite games of all time lists. I am one of those people. In my eyes, Outer Wilds is one of the best games ever made. It is a mandatory, must-play, drop everything you're doing right now and seek it out game. Do you remember my incessant praise of The Witness? Remember how it stood head and shoulders above every other game that came out in 2016? Well, Outer Wilds stands head and shoulders above The Witness. Not only is it in the conversation for best game of the decade and last generation, but I also earnestly believe that it's in the conversation for best game of all time. So instead of vaguely meandering on about the game, I'd like to do my best to help you see it through my eyes. I will be getting into spoilers, but there will be time codes to skip past them all if needed. Outer Wilds has a world that you can get lost in. It's an impressively crafted universe that has a little bit of everything. Each planet offers its own unique style and gimmick that the player must navigate around. From the storm-torn giant steep to the barely put-together brittle hollow, each planet will have you guessing at every turn. At first glance, the planets seem quite simple and straightforward. I mean, when you fly towards a planet, you can take in pretty much the entire surface of it and what's there. But Mobius did such a fantastic job of ensuring that all of the planets are layered with content. Giant Steep initially seems to be a simple planet with 4 or 5 small islands to explore, but it actually holds some of the most lore in the game. Dark Bramble comes off as if it's some sort of weird Lost Forest type puzzle, but in reality, it has some of the most crucial story elements in the game hidden in it. Mobius only had these few planets to work with, and they made sure to fill each planet with as much content as they possibly could while ensuring that they didn't overwhelm the player. They did a fantastic job of ensuring that their world was a vast and intriguing place, filled to the brim with secrets which begged you to explore around every nook and cranny. Something else I also loved about Outer Wilds' world design was how much Mobius managed to craft a living, breathing universe with a believable backstory to it. Much like many prior games that have phenomenal world building, Outer Wilds' world feels like it was here long before the player arrived, and that you're only paying it a short visit. The Harthian race does not feel like a generic race that was just materialized out of thin air specifically for the purpose of this game. Instead, it's as if they've been around for centuries and that you are but the next in line in the spacefaring species' endeavors. This is hammered home by the game's phenomenal introduction, which blends exploration with tutorial in a seamless way, teaching you all about who you are and where you come from, as well as how to maneuver the space gadgets you'll be bringing with you. Honestly, Outer Wilds' intro is a masterclass on how to introduce your player to an alien world, and I really should talk about... Okay, so this part will be a little less structured than the rest of this video, but I really did want to just gush about how good the intro is. Firstly, it makes all of the tutorialization optional. So for returning players, you don't have to sit through a long, boring exposition session. If you know what you're doing, you can get right to the good stuff within minutes. Which, hey, is kind of the whole idea behind Outer Wilds. It's almost as if this tutorial is a perfect microcosm of the entire game. Secondly, the actual tutorials are fantastic. They teach you all about how to maneuver the game's various systems in a safe and controlled environment before throwing you into the real world where there are real threats. Third, I adore how much the game plants little tidbits of knowledge all throughout the intro that first-time players may just glance over, but once you've completed the game and come back to them, you'll realize how much was actually sitting there staring you in the face. I'm gonna delve into some spoilers here, so here's a time code in case you want to scroll past them. My favorite, and probably the most emotional of the hidden details, is the ghost matter that's at the top of the Timberhearth settlement. When going through the game, I didn't actually realize that the interloper wiped out all Nomai life in the galaxy until my second time through. And when listening to Arcos talk about how ghost matter evaporates with time, it then hit me that these pockets of ghost matter all throughout the galaxy were from the interloper. It's just incredible. Anyways, when you talk to Hornfelds to get the launch codes, the game presents you with the question, what's the first thing you'll do when you get into space? It's a totally normal question that players probably didn't give any second thought to, but oh, what's this? That's right, it's another masterfully placed little piece of game design. The responses the game gives you to choose from aren't just quirky snips to get a laugh out of the player. Instead, they're actual suggestions the game devs are giving you to help you out with where to start. This is especially genius because before this point, you didn't really have much of an idea of where to go. Finally, this. Anyways, that's just what I could notice was amazing about the intro. Now, can all the big-name game developers watching me go study it and stop having me walk down hallways while being lectured at? Now, where were we? Oh, right. The idea that this universe existed before you booted the game up is applied to the galaxy, as every planet feels as if it is truly a planet in the celestial sense. A large rock that has been hurtling through space for eons and eons that has developed its own unique ecosystems and cultures. As you explore more of this wonderfully rich universe, you come to realize just how beautiful it all is, how every piece is perfectly in place, and how the game falls wonderfully at your feet, slowly unraveling itself before you. The universe of Outer Wilds being crafted with this pervasive idea of a long-standing ethos that existed well before you arrived naturally leads the player to want to explore every ounce of it. Every planet holds on it its own secrets, and each planet has a small thread that the player slowly pulls out until they discover the monumental secrets hidden before them. It's somewhat remarkable how much is hidden on each planet, right under your nose in fact. Brittle Hollow fakes you out by appearing to be a gigantic barren wasteland being bombarded by a volcano moon. However, underneath the surface lies the most vast and complex of the Nomai settlements. Outer Wilds is filled to the brim with similar ideas, and all throughout you are repeatedly uncovering them. Nothing is done better in this game than capturing the naturally inquisitive nature of the explorer. The way Mobius essentially built this Jenga tower of secrets for you to knock over and have laid bare is actually astounding. You just so happen to show up right as everything begins falling into place, but only barely, as you're the last piece of the puzzle that gets the ball rolling. There's always something waiting for you out there in the universe, and Outer Wilds does such a wonderful job of leading you to explore all of its corners, and to uncover the beauty of this universe surrounding you. Outer Wilds is the quintessential representation of those dime store sci-fi paperback novel covers. You know, the ones where Timmy and Johnny are looking at some sort of cosmic horror unleashing itself in front of them in their like 40s era imagining of spacesuits. If you could distill Outer Wilds gameplay into a pure, refined essence, it would be those covers. In fact, that's what they did with the collector's edition. You're dropped into a completely new universe with next to no recognizable features, so you are right alongside the player character on this ride and figuring out what's going on and why you're here. This is one of Outer Wilds' biggest strengths, as it does such a wonderful job of establishing this giant, looming presence of the great unknown. All throughout the game, you'll constantly have this feeling of something larger on the horizon, and this all starts from your first interactions with this world. Hell, it starts from the first second you start the game. From the word go, you are constantly inundated with little bits and pieces of what came before and what is to come, in such a way that you always have a question in your head that needs answering. From when you first start the game to the time that you actually leave your home planet, you will most likely already have so many questions that you'll want answered. Just enough info is drip-fed to you through the intro sequence that it essentially lights the fuse on each distinct branch of the story. Then when you finally leave your home planet, you're vaguely told to go to your moon, and after that, you'll likely end up on another planet, for me it was Giant's Deep, and at some point, you will die. All along the way, you'll be picking up more and more tiny fragments of info that may give you some answers, but will also assuredly light that fire of adventure in your heart. From there, the really big questions start forming and the gears start turning, namely because of the game's first big reveal. After that moment, you are set loose on the universe to figure out what exactly is going on. Of course, the expectation of the game isn't that the player should immediately figure everything out and find all the tidbits of info scattered throughout the world as soon as possible. Instead, you are given just oh so barely enough to be led into the next step. What specifically makes Outer Wilds so genuinely special is that your journey is not a direct linear progression. You uncover what you want when you want to, and every step of this adventure is tailored to you and your current interests within this universe. Every step is a meaningful one that you, the player, took. You're constantly investigating what you want and uncovering more and more about what is truly going on around you. It is a non-stop ride where no matter how much you pull at its strings, there will always be another thread for you to follow until the credits roll. This feature helps to cement the player's immersion in this world by letting them feel as if they are the main character uncovering this mystery. It's not being told to you by some ethereal, omniscient narrator. This is all about you and what you find out. Outer Wilds is happy to simply let the player loose and have them go on a grand adventure. One filled with twists and turns, trials and tribulations, conflict and resolution. You begin as a simple Hearthian in a long line of Hearthians who go into space to learn more about their universe. And, without getting too much into spoilers, let's just say that you end in a way that you could not possibly foresee from the moment you wake up on that first beautiful starry night. Actually, if I were to tell you what your first and last moments of this game were, and then followed that up by telling you that they flow into one another absolutely flawlessly, you absolutely would not believe me. But Isn't that the best possible description of a great adventure? From humble beginnings to incredible endings with a natural progression all the way through. That is Outer Wilds at its core. In the most purely metaphorical of ways, you are an alien archaeologist dusting off the bones of an ancient precursor civilization and attempting to piece together what came before you. By the end of it all, you'll have gone there, back again, and come to incredible realizations whilst having seen astounding sights. Outer Wilds is, at its purest form, a spectacular adventure that everyone should experience. But of course, what is the actual video game like? You know, the part where you hit buttons and stuff happens on the screen. How does one make a game like the one I've outlined, where it's mostly a non-linear story being pieced together by the player? Well, to put it in the most reductive of terms, Outer Wilds is a puzzle game. However, it's not a traditional puzzle game along the lines of a Witness or a Layton game where you stare at puzzles until something clicks in your head. Instead, imagine yourself walking around a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, where all the edges are a bit blurred and you can't quite tell where each piece fits, but you can definitely imagine where they might go. That's Outer Wilds. As I've alluded to many times before in this video, there will always be a thread that you can follow that will tease just enough info about what's to come. You'll never find yourself really scratching your head saying, well, now what, and flying to random planets while scouring the surface looking for any and all clues. There's always something looming over the horizon, gently tugging you in whichever direction it pleases. For the game to be set up in such a free-flowing way, yet always having some pieces of info available to you, is astounding. But even more than that, all of the critical pieces of info are buried in such a way that the only way to access them is by going down one of these paths. This is where the non-linear design really shines, and the puzzle-like nature of unraveling the story comes up. Outer Wilds is unique in that your progression isn't dependent on getting a double jump or some new suit that lets you go wherever you couldn't go previously. Rather, your progression in this game is limited entirely on your own knowledge. Not only is this a super unique way of structuring your game, but it's also extremely effective and makes perfect sense for the world of Outer Wilds. So instead of fighting Kraid to get the Varia suit, you go on to Ash Twin and learn a little bit about how Dark Bramble works. Much in the same vein as these more traditional games though, the major points of knowledge need to be hidden behind a certain amount of work in order to prevent the player from finding out everything they need to know in their first couple of hours. None of this feels artificial though. Each logical jump makes perfect sense and it never really falls onto the player to make a complete random guess as to how they need to progress. It's sort of like a tier-based system of knowledge, where at the bottom level it's mostly lore and info leading you to the next tier. Then you get some important facts about the world, and finally you get your critical info that allows you to progress the story, as it were. What's really beautiful about this structure is that it all plays on each other and leads naturally into one another without ever feeling convoluted. It would be oh so easy to tell the same story in a relatively linear fashion, but then it wouldn't be the same game. The whole ethos of this game is exploration. The player needs to uncover the story because the main character is uncovering the story just the same. This is not a story that is happening to the player, but rather one that is being discovered. This is why the gameplay is so perfect. Had this game been executed in any other way, I don't think it would have landed as hard. Every major element of the story needed to be buried under something, because the entire point of this game is for you to uncover the secrets of your universe. No matter where you go or what you do, so long as it's pertaining to the plot in some way, shape, or form, you will be progressing. Even if you spend 20 minutes doing seemingly nothing, you'll have ruled out a possible scenario that it could have been. Even in those most extreme cases, you never end up bashing your head against a wall. Every puzzle, so to speak, is fleshed out in such a way that the next step makes perfect sense so long as you give it some thought. There's no need to sit down and hire a team of code crackers to figure out what the Ash Twin project is, because every piece of info is sitting there staring you in the face. There is nothing I appreciate more in a game than when it feels as if every single aspect had been thought through and placed with intention. Previously, the only games on this list were Mother 3 and The Witness, but Outer Wilds has easily joined them. The world of Outer Wilds has such an immense amount of thought and care put into it. It is so readily apparent that the developers had a clear goal in mind, and they worked tirelessly to execute it. There is no filler. Every aspect of the story was considered and expanded upon. There is no one-off weirdo side path story that tells you about some entirely irrelevant character doing irrelevant things. In fact, the only side content that the game has to offer does nothing but further expand the world you're in and help flesh out the more intricate parts of the story. Now, it's one thing to do this with a game that's relatively small in scope, but this is a 20+ hour, full-fledged video game. Not only that, but it's got so many interconnecting pieces that call back on each other constantly, which only amplifies the absurd complexity of such a task almost tenfold. I just want you to imagine designing something like this. Mobius Digital didn't just write a story, they full-on created a world with a rich history and a compelling backstory that inspires the player to go on a grand journey. Writing a good story is hard enough, but to then flesh out all the aspects of it in such a way that every single one resolves in a meaningful way, I mean, it's immensely difficult, but they freaking did it. The fact that, despite all of these things working against Outer Wilds, that it all feels so well put together is remarkable. Ultimately, what you're left with is a perfectly whole unit, a game that does not need trimming or expanding. Every ounce of Outer Wilds also draws upon itself to inspire the player to continue exploring. You can find info on Giant's Deep that will lead you to the Ash Twin, which leads you to Dark Bramble, and so on and so forth. Just from a design standpoint, it's hard to wrap your head around executing a game like this. So many moving pieces affecting one another can easily lead to some aspects of the story feeling disconnected, or the entire story turning into a discombobulated mess. Even more so because the player is capable of picking up a story thread from any point within it. You could unravel the Ash Twin project and its associated story in reverse, and it would be just as meaningful and impactful as any other way. So for Outer Wilds to not only tackle this form of storytelling, but to also knock it out of the park is simply stunning. No piece of this game is out of place. Every single ounce of it had so much consideration put into it, and it absolutely shows. For instance, some of the earliest things you see in the game, which fit incredibly comfortably into the story, are called back upon multiple times throughout your journey. Each and every single time it happens, it doesn't feel like the game is referencing some forbidden relic that was lost to time 14 hours ago. Instead, it simply brings back another chunk of the story into play, revolving around whatever it is that you might be investigating at the time. These added wrinkles continuously pile onto the complexity of the story. However, this never leaves you to feeling overwhelmed. This is partly because of the well-designed journal system the game uses, but also because the structure of the story works in sort of a jigsaw puzzle-like way, where two seemingly unrelated parts will fit together before you know it. That is simply breathtaking to me. For a world so interconnected and rich with history to feel so easily understood is a remarkable achievement on Mobius Digital's part. I cannot stress enough how entwined this entire story is, and how there are so many layers to it all, and how it is executed flawlessly. Other games struggle to do the same with more runtime and a less complicated story, and for that, Outer Wilds deserves to have its praises sung to the high heavens. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Outer Wilds is its ability to elicit powerful emotional reactions from the player. The last word you'd use to describe a space-based exploration game is emotional, but a game hasn't wrecked me this hard since Mother 3. And it's not necessarily that it's sad, right? Because sad is easy. Here's a dog. You love this dog, don't you? Oh, what a wonderful dog. And he's dead. There you go. That's sadness, and it's one of the easiest emotions to get out of the player because of how much time they can invest in your world and your characters. What's incredible about Outer Wilds is that it invokes a vast range of emotions, and it does so beautifully and without at all feeling forced or corny. Once again, I feel the need to reiterate that this is a game about exploring some fictional galaxy. Space and nerdy things in that realm don't necessarily lend themselves to emotional too well. How does one make the exploration of a black hole emotional? Or how about poring over your notes with your fellow scientists? Well, to put it simply, you add an element of humanity to everything. Outer Wilds has every aspect of its world glazed over with just a tad of humanity. For example, one of the ways you discover a big secret about Dark Bramble is by following the story of some children sneaking away to play in a cave that their parents forbid them from. It's a small detail, but how many of you watching went somewhere to play with your friends when your parents told you not to? These small human moments make it so much easier for the player to feel more attached to this alien world. Of course, it'd be extremely easy and honestly lazy to relay that information to the player through an audio log or some kind of grizzled veteran who can share all kinds of secrets. But would it have had even half the impact? No, I wouldn't be sitting here writing about the crazy cool audio log that tells you about this, because it wouldn't have stuck with the player in the slightest. Every ounce of Outer Wilds carries this fragment of humanity. Through the happy and the sad, there is always that air of perseverance and curiosity that really can only be described as the human condition. I'd also like to take this time to mention one of the most effective tools in Outer Wilds' arsenal as well, which would be its music. Outer Wilds does not sport the most insane OST ever seen. I mean, it's really only a handful of songs, but what's there is so much more memorable than any banger OST I've come across, simply due to how it's used within the game. Much like Breath of the Wild, Outer Wilds' music is just as much a tool as the gameplay. Certain tracks are hammered into your head again and again such that you begin associating them with certain events. As soon as one track comes on, you know exactly what's about to happen. In its development of these Pavlovian responses, Outer Wilds gives itself what is essentially the emotional golden gun. It can only ever flip your expectations on their head once, and they know that. So, of course, when it comes time to defy your preconceived notions, it knocks it out of the freaking park. The surge of emotions that you'll feel the 1 or 2 times the game does this will be monumental. However, it wouldn't have worked without Outer Wilds' masterful amount of restraint. And, of course, I'd be remiss to not at least touch on the ending. Obviously some big spoilers up ahead, so jump here if you want to skip them. To try and put why the ending of Outer Wilds is so effective into words is going to be difficult. Quite honestly, a lot of its impact is achieved through your time spent with the game. You start to become familiar with this world, and it all starts to make you feel at home. You can start a loop and navigate your way around the galaxy with hardly any issues, bypassing hazards with next to no effort. But just as soon as it all starts to settle, you find out that your universe is dying and that you're in the same position as the Nomai and trying to at least figure out what the eye of the universe is and why it's calling out. This colors the last quarter of the game with an overwhelming amount of melancholy. In the back of your mind, you know there's no way you're making it out of this, but hopefully through your efforts you can at least get closure, right? You undergo preparations for the final loop, figuring out all the steps you'll need to take and planning how to execute them when you're finally ready. Then it's time. Your final loop spent in this game will have you go through such a vast range of emotions. Fear, uncertainty, doubt, hope, happiness. All of these emotions will well up within you as you make your way to the eye. This is further exacerbated by the absolutely brilliant soundtrack here, where they flip the end of loop song on its head and play it as you make your way to Dark Bramble. It's played in such a way that this time, instead of your time loop, it's your universe that's coming to an end. But when listening to it, you'll realize it's nowhere near as ominous and imposing as it usually is. It almost has an air of excitement to it. Anyways, fast forward through a bunch of gameplay and we get to the eye. Here we begin the best ending sequence of any video game I have ever witnessed. For starters, you're in control of your character the entire time. I think games these days are too focused on showing instead of telling, and maintaining player control during the ending amplifies its effectiveness tenfold. Having you go on a journey with this character for 20 plus hours, then ripping them away from you during the most important part of the story would have been a slap in the face, and antithetical to the entire point of the game. Now, because you're still in control the entire time, the game still leaves things for you to do, which prevents the ending from feeling like it's stopped once you teleported to the eye. You're doing your job to the absolute bitter end, and control is only taken away from you for the last, 30 seconds? You are not done controlling your character until he is well and truly dead. This commitment to player agency is what makes this ending so impactful. You are your character. Everything happening to them is happening to you. I mean, not really, our universe has a couple trillion years left in it, but you get what I mean. What really sets this ending apart from others, though, is that you aren't doing some super epic final moment Hail Mary to save the universe. No, you and everything you love and hold dear is going to die. Instead, your final moments are spent seeking comfort. The entire ending sequence is, essentially, you gathering your friends' instruments for one last jam session. After all the time you spent talking to them, using your signoscope to locate their distant instrument, going over what you found in the galaxy with them, you bring them alongside you in your final hours for one last moment of peace. You take these songs and these instruments that you've become so intimately familiar with and gather them around a campfire in a hope to feel some comfort in your final moments. You just want to play a song with your friends around the fire one last time. For most players, this will be the first time they'll actually hear all of the instruments overlapping at once. And to say it was emotional is a bit of an understatement. The Traveler's theme is such a powerful song in this instance. It captures that feeling of comfort perfectly, and to have the ending be the player effectively gathering the pieces of it so they can hear it one last time is simply genius. The final moments you spend alive in your own universe before the end of it all are just so human. These moments, combined with the stellar visuals the game chooses to present to you, make this ending work in a way that is honestly astounding. Once it's all over, you'll be left feeling a whole range of things, but ultimately the player is left satisfied as they'll have investigated everything they wanted to in the universe before setting out on their final journey, and the player character's story is resolved in a way that feels genuine and not at all forced. Obviously, Outer Wilds is a 5 out of 5. This game is an absolute masterpiece front to back. It is one of the most unique, enjoyable, thought-provoking, and moving experiences I've had the pleasure of enjoying in my entire life. The loving craftsmanship of Outer Wilds needs to be celebrated for the rest of our years, because a game this well made is a once-in-a-lifetime achievement. Even the best games have faults, but for Outer Wilds, I genuinely cannot bring myself to name one. The minor inconveniences are blown away like space dust in a supernova. The sheer massive display of quality and talent that Outer Wilds brings simply dwarfs all of the minute grievances I had. With all that being said, if there's only one single thing that I want someone to take away from this video, it's to at least give this game an honest try. It starts a bit slow, but I promise you it is worth the investment. I don't invoke comparisons to Mother 3 often, so trust me, it is worth your time. And if you drop it at first, that's okay. I dropped it and had to come back to it some months later once it started blowing up on social media, and boy am I ever glad I made that choice. So yeah, play Outer Wilds, it's pretty good.